Spread it out. Just grab your name tag.
All right. Good evening. Welcome to the Tuesday, January 18th Board of Education special meeting discussing the budget. We have Mr. Liu, Mrs. Brand, Mrs. Dow. Mrs. Zahn is out of town. She has a relative who's ill, and she's attending to that, so we wish her well. Mrs. Iacono's here. Mrs. Albin should be here shortly. Mr. Carey and Mr. Fatabine, and we have staff from central office here, and welcome everyone else. Let's rise and say the Pledge of Allegiance. So we are on to item 3, presentation and discussion of the superintendent's recommended 2011-2012 budget request. Just a couple of opening remarks. First, for elected officials who are here tonight, there are budget books for you in the back for you to keep. There are other budget books that the public can look at, but I believe the note there says when you're done looking at them, return them to the back table. So we have the meeting tonight, January 18th. We have a special meeting on the budget this Thursday, which is the 20th, and then we will be voting. The schedule is to vote on this budget next Tuesday, what's the date? I forget. 24th. 25th, next Tuesday. These are our working sessions, tonight and Thursday. On the 25th, there will be an opportunity for public comment at that meeting. Obviously, any members of the public who want to email us over the next week about the budget or any other issue, feel free to do so. So with that said, I will turn this over to Dr. Title.
All right, thank you. I don't have the usual PowerPoint I think you're accustomed to. This budget is so different in format from what you've seen before. I want to take you on a bit of a tour of it and comment on the changes we've made, not just in the format of the budget, in the way we've developed this budget, and in the priorities, the substance of what's in here. This is almost a completely new enterprise this year for the staff up here. I just want to say up front to Bonnie McQuain and her staff and other people in the central office that translated these crazy ideas the superintendent had about doing this budget from scratch into a reality was nothing short of miraculous. With the munis not really behaving itself and all the other problems, and I asked them to rethink everything they're doing about the budget. After doing it for so many years, I just want to be upfront with that what you see here is the result of months of anguish, mostly on Bonnie's part. But the goal was to simplify and clarify the budget document so that it would be easier to follow, laid out in a logical fashion, so that everything would be clearer and also less redundant. There were a lot of redundancies in the previous document. By my count, we used to have 6 different versions of the budget in here to look at. Now we're really down to 2. I basically have a detailed budget by object and a less detailed budget by department. So we've tried to do that. There was also a tremendous amount of redundant text scattered throughout the other document. The text here has been put in one place, and you probably have seen it, but I'll just point out where that is. We also wanted to be as clear as possible about the way we use grants, both in the current year and in the projection for next year, because we build the budget net of grants. And so it's important for you to see exactly where we project the grants to be used. So to the extent possible, we have put in exactly how we plan to use the grants next year and how that's different or the same as the current year. We wanted to clarify the staffing in the district and to show which staff members are paid out of the operating budget, which staff members are paid out of grants or other revenue, and for the first time including, and this really caused a lot of angst up here, including the permanent part-time hourly staff members that we have that are employees but have never been in the FTE count. And I'll show you where that is. There's a document here called Total Staffing that I think will clarify all of that for you. Because there's been some discussion about well, if it's in a grant, does that mean it's an FTE or not? And really, you're an employee one way or the other. If you're in a grant, that means we can't use the grant for something else. So we really tried to clear that up. Tried to clarify when we need funds for additional positions, sometimes that's because they're new in the budget, but that's because grant funding is drying up, as opposed to new, where there are extra employees that we don't currently have. So I wanted to try to make that clear. The classic in this budget is that SFSF funding of $512,000. It's paying for quite a few positions. So we have to add those positions to the operating budget, but they're not new positions. We're not adding bodies, but we have to change them if we want to continue them onto the payroll. Where possible, where we had, and this was sort of littered through the budget, multiple accounts used for purchasing the same item, we combine it into one account. So in the previous years, interns were some in the school budget, some in a district subsidy, some in another place in the district. Now they're all in one place. Supplies, books, and materials are all in one place, instead of some in the schools, some in the central office. Substitute teachers used to be professional days versus sick combined. We clearly wanted to show the impact of the SFS dollars that are flowing back to the town. That's a tricky little quirk because this isn't like a grant that runs out and the money goes away. The SFSF is a grant that is coming to us and next year will go to the town. So the net to the town doesn't change, but we have to include those dollars in our budget. So that's why there's sort of like 2% increases in here. It's a little confusing. I knew it would be 2 years ago when they decided to make this shift, but that's, I just want to show the impact of that clearly. I wanted to be clear about where we've already responded to some of the suggested areas from the operational audit. And there's a page in here that identifies where we didn't do exactly maybe what the audit suggested, that they pointed us to an area and we were able to extract some savings by doing something in that area. So that's in there as a separate page, because I know, as we talked about at the last meeting, that's a concern. What are we doing with the audit? I wanted to show that we are using it and paying attention. Just a little note on the format. You'll see when we go through the detail. The current year estimated expenditures column was not complete. We just couldn't get that done, but it will be included in the final document when we get it. If there's a specific one that you really need to know more about, we can get that for you, but that's something you've noticed. That's not something that we forgot to put in or are trying not to do, but in the press of time, it's not in there. So that's sort of the big picture on format and clarity and communication. Now, we did talk a few times ago that we're changing the way we sort of allocated money to the schools versus central allocation, because that was also resulting in some issues. The goal of changing the way we do allocations is to provide equity among the schools in staffing resources, technology resources, and remove from the school's responsibility some items that are beyond its control, like substitute teachers. To have that in a school budget puts a principal in a very difficult situation where they might have to withhold spending textbooks and supplies, not knowing what their sub-account is going to be like. And the sub-account is not really much that they can control. So we've moved all the expenses for substitute teachers out of the schools' budgets and into central control. Same thing with interns, because interns are going to be used largely for substituting. That's one of our cost savings. That's why it's going to be very difficult to compare a school budget year over year, because some elements of their budget are not their responsibility, and so they don't need as much funding to be at the same level they were in the other areas. All technology is now being budgeted centrally, including software, to standardize it where possible. I will tell you that to try to bring this budget in anything close to a responsible number meant that we just couldn't make as much progress in technology as I'd like to see. Just as an example, you will find no new smart boards in here. We just don't have that money. And at this point, we don't have a great plan for it, but we know there's an inequity there. We couldn't remedy it. We are installing projection unit, or proposing to install the projection units at Fairfield Ludlow High School, which are already at Ward. So that's an example of remedying an inequity, but we just don't have the funds to remedy all the inequities. And maybe at some point down the road, when the economy gets better, we'll be able to do that. We talked about sub-teachers and interns are centrally allocated. We've also developed a new, this is Ms. Katea Leonard, Margaret Murray Fitzgerald, elementary principals, worked on a new model of elementary staffing based on the size of the school and the number of sections to try to standardize that without being overly precise about it, and there's a couple pages in here that explain that. That's not just to standardize things, but I think that also will give us a better model of instructional delivery at the elementary schools, and so that's, that allocation has changed. And many accounts that had district level and school level allocations are now combined into one school level account, like supplies and materials. Used to be the principal, I mean, this was ripe for game playing, right? The principal would say, well, I have a supply and material budget, but then I know there's one over here in the central office. I'll go spend that one first, then if I need to spend mine. So when really, it's really should just be all in the principal's control. So we've moved it all into the school control. And then they just can't hit up Gary for extra money as easily. On the substance, my real overall goal here is to preserve our excellent instructional program. Keep our class sizes where they are, and keep up with the increasing enrollment. With the enrollment going up net, there's a decline at elementary, but it's going up at middle, it's going up at high school. To keep our class sizes and our programs in place, we do need some extra staff members, but you'll see back in here, the net new staff, actually new bodies into the district, is about 6, and we're having an increase of enrollment around 80. There are a few program improvements, but not a ton. I mean, you heard about the gifted. It's not a big money item, but that's a program improvement. The elementary staffing plan that I referenced, and some changes in the pre-K program that has a savings and is also, I believe, will be educationally beneficial, and that is to merge, to increase the slots in the pre-K at Burr, where we have space and staff, and where we don't have space and staff, we still don't have space at McKinley, to merge that with the ECC program. We can get into that more if you'd like. But that's really, a lot of this budget is to preserve what we have, which is really good. Like to keep the forward momentum going in technology. The audit had, you know, a whole chapter on technology. We got to do more with it. It's got to be a priority. Like to keep the forward momentum going, but you run into the brick wall of, now, how many resources can we put here in 1 year before the budget's unmanageable? So we'd like to keep the forward momentum going in technology. We really need to try to restore some of the major cuts that were taken in the maintenance projects last year to keep the buildings up. And we just have a lot of buildings to maintain, and it's expensive to maintain them. I will say Tom had about 4 times the amount of projects that are not in here. Also, we found that there's some budget lines where we haven't really budgeted realistically, and every year we run a deficit, and it was time to start to move that around. The biggest area, and part of this is an ARA funding cliff issue, but there's lines where we've historically overspent. Special education tuition, computer repairs, we've run out of money already in that account. And what that does is when you sort of under budget that way, you end up freezing money in other accounts. And you know you do it every year. So why not just put it where it should go in the first place and not pretend like you really have it in other lines? So trying to match up the budget to actual expenditures. So you'll see movement around in there. Tried to squeeze savings out of undesignated revenue wherever we could. Open choice as an example of that. And you'll see it in here exactly where we plan to put that money. Trying to get money out of transportation so we can spend it on staff and instruction. And that's why I've got a proposal to move the high school start times back to 7:30 to save $500,000. And trying to save money in the medical costs where we can. And we talked about that at the last meeting in terms of the stop loss, increasing the stop loss from 150 to 300. It's worth about $450,000. So we can focus on keeping our instructional program strong. And lastly, and you'll see it in here, this part I was probably the least clear about, is the capital projects fund, not part of the operating budget. In the first selectman's plan that he brought forward on August 30th that I watched, he had said the schools in his plan would be allocated $2 million a year. So we have taken projects that are on the list of capital projects. They couldn't be fit into this budget. They are on the proposed long-range facilities plan. So they're in here. But I'm, again, open for how we're going to play that one out. Right now we don't have great guidance on how that's supposed to work. So I have it in here. It's actually under $2 million, but they're all worthwhile projects. That's sort of a separate account. All right, so let's take a quick tour of the book. I'm sure you've all devoured it, but Yes, you haven't, other than the letter. There's only a few tabs. The first part, after the table of contents, is just some district information. On page 3, you'll see the audit and the recommendations in the budget that relate to the audit. Some have cost savings, some don't. There are some cost-saving measures that we have put in place in addition to that. These aren't all of them, but these are in the business service areas. And then you've got the 5-year budget history that shows in particular the rather small increases the board has received in its operating budget in the last 2 years. The next tab is all the revenue side. So this is all the income side. It starts with an overview of the revenue, last year's revenue, the current year expected revenue, and then our estimated revenue for next year that we built the budget off of. Starts with the revenue that goes directly to the town, and you can see right there on the first line on page 6, the education cost-sharing grant going from $3,077,840 to $3,590,008. That's the effect of that SFSF funding going back to the town and not directly to the Board of Ed. State Fiscal Stabilization Fund, part of ARA. All right, so that's sort of the overview. And then the next few pages, I'm not going to go through them all, are details of how we're going to spend the grant money, how we have spent it, how we're planning to spend it this year, and what we propose to do with it next year. So that's really the revenue section. And then there's a description of all the revenue areas. You've had that in the budget before. All right, so that's that tab. There's an executive summary, which is sort of a combination of executive summaries that you've had before. Really shows 2% increases, 2 percentage increases. One is the increase in that particular category, and then there's of what that means to the total budget. So just as an example, this is on page 24. Under existing staffing, on the far right, the percent increase is 2.82%. So that's the increase in that category. But in terms of its impact on the total budget, it's a 1.82 percentage points of the 4.9 that we need. That's the distinction between those two columns. I think in the past you might have had this in 2 different places, so it's all in one. Okay, so that's the executive summary with a few graphs. And at the bottom of the executive summary on page 25, you can see the 2 budget increases. The gross budget increase of 4.90%, but then when you subtract out the SFSF funding, the net to the town, in terms of what the town will need to fund for this, is 4.54. The budget detail really has, the biggest part is the object summary, and that goes from pages 28, this is really the guts of the budget, 28 through 87. So that's sort of a clump. And then the explanation of what's in there are the next pages, the narrative. And this is the narrative that was sort of the combined narrative. The narrative serves a couple purposes. We may not hit everything. In some cases, we're simply explaining what it is. You know, what does CES affiliation mean? There's an explanation of it. In other cases, we try to explain why there's an increase in that line. So maybe that if your first question is, why is there an increase in this line, you might want to check this section to see if we've explained it already. It may answer your question. So the budget detail explanation ties directly back to the that object budget. And then there's a budget by department, so you can go school by school. It's a little less detailed, but it gives you the flavor of, you know, if you're at Burr, what does it mean? The only thing I would caution people about at the school-by-school budget is when you see an FTE count here, these are only FTEs paid out of the operating budget, and there's another display in the support information that shows total staff at each school by source. So anyway, that's that. So that's really the budget detail that's in there. Then the support information roughly follows the object sequence. So this is back up to the 100 series, 200, 300, 400, 500, roughly in that order. So we start with enrollment, historical and projected enrollment, which really leads us into class size, which is the big nut. I mean, 78% of our budget is salary and benefits, so this is where the action is. We have our enrollment projection for 11-12 that we're basing the budget on. Then we have what I call honest chart, which is the current class sizes and the projected class sizes and the change in sections at the elementary level, using the same guidelines that we've tried to do, with one exception. We don't have enough space at McKinley to do the McKinley guidelines at every grade, but the class sizes there are still very nice. And what this shows you is that we're actually projecting 6 fewer elementary classrooms next year than we currently have. Of course, 4 of those positions were paid out of grant funds, so it only saves us 2 in the operating budget, but it's 6 nonetheless. Then we've got middle school class size and some summary of high school class sizes. So you sort of got a class size piece in there. Then we get into staffing, because of course staffing is what makes the class size happen. Page 139, I want to draw your attention to, that's the total staffing comparison. That's the in a nutshell. How many people do we have now in terms of FTEs? And this includes certified and non-certified, operating budget grants, and permanent part-time hourly employees, and what their full-time equivalent would be. And so you've got the changes there, and when you can see on the bottom right-hand corner there is this budget proposal has a difference of 6.20 in terms of FTE count. And we have to budget for more than that because we've lost some grant money. But the question is, how many extra positions is the superintendent recommending in the budget? The proper answer is 6.2. So that's the overview. That's sort of the in a nutshell. And then we go into some detail. For example, certified operating budget, the difference in the FTE is 19.3, and we explain how that was arrived at, and that's the detail below. You know that some of these are simply staff being moved out of grants into the operating budget. This is page 140. And there's some deletions, some fractions based on enrollment. You can see that as the bubble moves through the middle school and more students go to the high school, that's the majority of where it is. The elementary staffing plan is explained later, but that's the reading and the math in there. But we've also done some subtracting. And then the next page, 141, are the staff changes in the operating budget, but the non-certified version. Less action there. But that's, so there's your total net new staff in the operating budget, 20.9, but those are not new positions. The vast majority of that are people coming out of revenue streams and into the operating budget. And then there's just detail around all of that and a grant detail. And then there's a staffing by school. So this will show for every school the staff and the source of funding and the total staff allocated to that school. So if you're interested in staffing at a school, this is the better page to look at rather than the departmental operating budget. And then there's a description of the elementary staffing model and the improvements to it, which is not, again, I think this is about providing better instructional interventions to kids. And you can see we've reconceptualized the whole thing, including how we use our interns. There's the gifted program budget, which you saw at the last meeting. Out-of-district tuition is going to take a hit, and there's a page with the calculation there. The medical profit and loss summary, you saw that at the last meeting also. That's just in there as well. And then, because technology is so important, and there are some increases there we're trying to get, we put more detail about the technology department budget in here than you would have normally, than you would normally find. And then a little more detailed explanation of the food service program. That's not part of our budget. Food service is not in our budget, but we've made some improvements to the program, and I wanted to blend those in, and we wanted to have a sort of plain language explanation about the fund balance in that program. So there's an extra paragraph in there on page 172, and then there's the capital projects, and it's 174 pages. So that's your guided tour of the budget and the rationale and how we tried to put that together. And so I think at that point I'll stop, Mr. Chairman, and we can get into the Q&A. I will do my best to answer questions, but I reserve the right to call on more knowledgeable folks around the table or potentially in the audience.
Thank you, Dr. Title, for that presentation, and this is our time, so I will look to board members to see who has questions and who wants to kick this off. Mrs. Brand.
I'm going to start with page 50. Relative to the health insurance. Item number 53255. There's a decrease in the amount that we're putting in for retirees. Am I reading the right numbers?
No.
Okay.
Looks like it's the same.
Then maybe I'm not looking at, because you can see I'm reading off of my scribbles. There were a couple of, well, I have a number. There looked like life insurance, disability, and pension. There was a great increase in pension. There was a decrease in disability.
Yes.
And I wanted an explanation of where we were going with these.
Okay, so first of all, on the health insurance retirees, 53255, that was $1,153,000, and it still is. Moving down to life insurance, that's the same, $153,000. The big decrease is in disability insurance.
Right.
And that is because the town and the board jointly have rebid the vendor for the disability insurance, and while a vendor has not officially been selected, the bids are all substantially lower than what we're paying now, and in fact,
It's just the Board of Education.
Just the Board of
Town
Ed.
doesn't
Oh,
have
thank you.
disability.
so Bonnie has been on top of this and been watching it, and so there's no change in the coverage. We're just going to change the vendor, and so that's a plus.
Okay.
Rebidding the disability insurance. Pension, that is determined, that is increasing.
It's page 51
That's page 51,
at the top.
473,000. That's the continuing issue of fully funding the pension, the obligations that the board has for retirees who are on the town's pension program. This is not teacher retirement pension.
Right.
And we get a report from the actuaries, the town and the board, and then Bonnie and Paul Hiller figure out who owns what part of it, and this is our increase this year. So it's an actuary projection of what we owe for pension obligations, and
It just was so much
it is what
higher.
it is.
Yeah.
Well, it was worse. It's just been steadily marching higher. And that's the performance of how the pension fund does relative to the retirees. And I don't know, Bonnie, if you want to talk about that a little more, but it's not a number we have any control over.
Correct.
Right? Yeah, it's like a fixed cost that doesn't do a thing to improve instruction, but it keeps the pension plan whole for the employees, and that's a good thing.
If anyone else is ready, I mean, I have other stuff, but I didn't want to hog it. Okay, I have page 54. And I have number 54580. Transportation changes for the gifted, or is it transportation, or I'm just looking to see what I have here. But my point is I see a decrease, and it was for Center for the Arts. Maybe I have this in the wrong. Yeah, there were 3 different places where I think it may not be on this page. I apologize. It may be, and I think it was transportation with summer school, Center for the Arts, and 6 to 6. You probably know where that is better than I.
Yeah.
And I apologize. I had number 54, 54580. I had page 63. I'm sorry. It is on 63. Sorry about that.
Mm. 63, which...
Well, I know I had a question also relative to this. Oh, it's actually on the top of, say, 64. And there's a decrease in the 6 to 6, a decrease in the summer school, and a decrease also in the Center for the Arts. And I just wondered how that happened.
For the summer school, it's $268. I'm not sure.
It was over, actually, a trend. I'm looking for how we were able
Yep.
to do that.
Well, on the 6 to 6, I believe, and Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, that we're going to use, we've got just a more efficient way to do it. I think it's some smaller buses, if I remember correctly. Is that it? Instead of the big buses, we can use the smaller buses. They don't cost quite as much.
Okay.
You know, we put John Fickey through the ringer to find savings wherever he can. So if he can figure out a way to make the runs work, then we'll take the savings. I don't know anything about summer school transportation. I guess I didn't jump out at me because it was hardly a move.
No, but that
I
was,
think there's anything there.
so you did it for a cost savings and were able to find different ways to do it?
Yeah, it's just a different
nothing enrollment-
calculation. No, there's
okay.
no change in the program in terms of not transporting as many kids or anything like
Okay,
that.
right, right.
I mean, we're, you know, like the 6 to 6 and other magnet transportation, you know, we provide that, but it depends how many kids sign up to go and where they live. So it's an estimate. And same thing with the Center for the Arts. So it's an estimate, but this is based on, you know, what John's been able to do in terms of finding savings by doing it a little more efficiently.
And then on page 63 above it, I noticed we had changes in transportation funds for extracurricular. One in particular was Osborne Hill. What I'm thinking, and what I think I saw here was that you were trying to line up what had actually happened as opposed to what was typically budgeted for.
Remind me if this is in the allocation.
It's in the allocation.
Thank you. The principals put it where they wanted it, what they thought they needed.
Okay, because there are decreases here all down that you know, it helps us, but I just wondered
Right.
how we got there.
Well, the overall allocation, though, probably didn't go down. I mean, it might have gone down because they're not having to fund as much, but this is just a priority area where they think they're going to need to spend their money for next year. So this is principal's decision.
Yeah, because it was throughout. That's what I'm, you know. Okay. Yeah, and same thing with sports facilities. Ward High School has a decrease where it's, you know, minus 2,040. And are our buses still at 57,000? Is that the estimate that they're worth? Okay.
That would be a Tier 1 bus, right, John? 57,000, right?
Where are the other tiers more or less?
More.
Okay.
Right. We pay, our bus contract has a daily rate based on whether the bus does 1 loop, 2 loops, or 3 loops. The holy grail is to have them all do 3 loops, but there is a slight sort of upcharge for that because it's running more.
But it cut backs on the total number.
Yes, you can cut back on the total number of buses. That's what happens when you move the high school start times back to 7:30, in addition to clearing up some of the traffic issues at Ludlow. You also allow then buses that are now currently unable to do a high school run and a middle school run to do it. So you get more buses doing a 2-tier. So you pay a little premium for that one bus because now it's doing 2 runs, but you might be taking a whole bus off the road. So your number is right for a Tier 1 bus. It goes up from there, not substantially.
Right.
So it's really in our interest to have as many 3-tier buses as
Use it as
possible.
much as possible,
Absolutely. That's the holy grail.
And I saw that the 10 buses for changing the high school start time. How? If you don't mind, just walk me through at least. I'm not sure I understand how you were able to do that.
Well, I personally did not do it. We give credit to John and his team. Basically, what they do is they take buses that and are able to do more runs with each bus. So therefore, we're able to reduce the total number of buses, and that is something that you know, he puts on a grid and he takes it and figures out. Okay, we got all these buses that are doing high school runs right now, and they're doing, say, high school runs, and they can't do middle school runs, but they could do elementary runs. If we back it up, how many more runs can it do? Can it do some private school runs that it wouldn't normally be able to do? Could it do a high school run and a middle school run and an elementary run? Maybe it could do all 3, depending on where they're going. And so the ins and outs of that are that you take 10 buses off the road, but then you have to pay a little bit more for some of the buses that are left because they're going from 1-tier to 2-tier to 3-tier. So if 10 buses is 57, you know, round numbers,
Right,
10 buses is 57,000, why isn't it 570?
Right.
It's not because you've got that premium differential for having these buses do more than 1 tier.
Right.
And so that's where we estimated it, you know, back. So I mean, John did it by actual students and where they are, and actually laid the whole thing out as if we were going to transport them tomorrow. What would it look like?
Yeah,
So it
that's-
wasn't just a random exercise. This was, I don't know, I'm saying hundreds of hours, but dozens of hours. But it was. It was. John and people at the bus yard. So they actually went through the process of laying the thing out to maximize the transportation. And, obviously, people have some concerns about that, but that's a big number. That I think
That's
could be
why
better
'cause
spent somewhere else.
That's a third of the buses that we currently have. That's why I was asking that 20 minutes, 10 minutes in one, 20 minutes in another, how we got there. And
That's not a third of the buses.
No, it's a third of the high school buses, isn't it, that we currently have?
Well, this is total buses taken off. The buses we have.
Oh, because you backed it up, is what you're saying?
Right.
Okay.
Exactly.
Before I forget, because I think I would be doing you a terrible disservice if I didn't, this book, I think, is much better organized. I like the layout. It's much more simple, much more direct. I do think much more user-friendly. I know there was an extraordinary amount of effort that went into this, but I can tell you I certainly appreciate it. And I know it didn't come easy, but I do think this is very well done, and I thank you for that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Who's next? I have a question, if no one's going to volunteer. This, I think, calls for a yes or no answer. On the,
I can do that.
And you may not be able to answer it. Obviously, I don't want you to talk about details. On our pension obligation on page 51, is any, maybe phrasing this the wrong way, is anyone from central office involved with any meetings that may relate to recovering some pension fund assets that were lost a couple of years ago? And I see the first selectman sitting here, and
Maybe he is. Bonnie will give it a shot. The answer is I don't know.
I am.
okay, that's all I wanted to know. Thank you. Any other board members? I have some questions if you want me to go, and we have 2 nights of doing this, so
They want to go home.
if you want to study this over the next 2 days and come back on Thursday, that's fine too, but I'll ask a few questions. You have in this document, I forget exactly where, tuition charges for the preschool, and I would like you to explain what are you talking about with respect to that.
Okay, we currently operate 2 different preschool models in the district. We actually operate a third one at the 2 high schools, which is part of the early childhood curriculum there. But separate from that, we operate 4-year-old half-day program, 1 at Burr and 1 at McKinley. 10 students in the morning, 10 students in the afternoon. We transport, and those slots are given to low-income families. And so there's no tuition charged there presently. And I'm not asking or recommending that we start to charge tuition in that program. The program that we also have that is currently underutilized by what I'll call typical peers is the Early Childhood Center program, the early childhood program we run at Ward High School in a separate space. It's a very nice facility, and we have room to really increase the number of non-special education children in that program. It would benefit everybody involved, and we'd be able to expand, which we can't currently do at McKinley because we need the space in the school. We don't have enough classrooms as it is, and we can't expand the pre-K at McKinley because it's currently in the room that used to be the teacher's lounge. So we're kind of stuck. That program at Ward could and would be a great, I think, educational benefit to all concerned if we open that up to more what we call typical peers, non-special education peers. Special education children in that program, no tuition for them. We have a legal obligation starting at on their 3rd birthday to educate them. But we can open that up to special ed, we call typical peers, and those are the folks that we would then institute a tuition on a sliding scale, so that it would be open to all residents, although it would be obviously very convenient for the McKinley folks. It's still right in the neighborhood. And in fact, we are going to allocate certain slots to the McKinley folks because of the fact that their program is essentially being merged. So anybody who's low income still won't pay tuition. But once you get above a certain level, these programs typically charge tuition. That was in the audit, and that was what they were talking about in terms of charging tuition. And typically, you don't know what you're going to get for revenue out of that because you don't know how many slots you have, because special education students are guaranteed a slot, and we don't know the income level of the families who will elect to send their children there. Typically, these programs take that money and reinvest it in the program. And so once you've done it for a year or two, you can get a more reliable income stream. But that was an audit recommendation, so it's just the program, the Early Childhood Center, for the typical peers. We would, I'm recommending that we increase the slots out at Burr as well, because we do have space and staff out there, no tuition out there, and if family can't afford it, there'd be no tuition at the ECC. But if we have a family that can afford it, they're getting kind of free education at age 3 and 4, and so it does make sense to institute a kind of a user fee there. That was a long answer to it, but it gets into the whole sort of game plan of, I think this is where, because the space is available and we have the staff, we save money in terms of staff. We offer pre-K to more kids. And I think we offer a higher quality program to the kids that are being served at the ECC by doing this. So to me, this is kind of a win-win-win situation. You know, and the difference between getting to McKinley for your pre-K or getting to Ward, I mean, they're right down the street. So I don't think it's geographically an issue. And we can increase the slots available out at Burr. And that will also help us with the racial imbalance. Because the more kids we can get to Burr, then more likely they'll stay at Burr, which will help us. And the pre-K kids at McKinley are counted toward the racial imbalance number, right? And because a greater percentage of kids in the pre-K at McKinley are minority students as compared to the regular population, it hurts us. So this also would help us with the racial imbalance. It's not the reason to do it, but it will help us.
Mrs. Brand, did you have a question on this?
Yeah, actually, I actually love the idea. My problem and my concern is the location, because it's Fairfield Ward High School, and we have a problem with, in the future, our high school space. And since I'm very aware that the first selectman is sitting in the audience, I wondered whether or not the idea of looking at Oldfield, where a child's garden is currently, I'm sure he's now cringing, because it's owned by the town. It also has that same use, whether or not this has been pursued. Because we could go down a road where we're looking at modifying high school space, adding on, and this actually might be a more cost-effective solution. And I know we're building a budget around it, but as I look at this, I just think it's worth asking.
We have not looked at that. The space, the ECC space that we have right now is really nicely designed for early childhood, and frankly, in my opinion, is underutilized. So we have an example of underutilized space where we can use it and improve things educationally and save money. So we looked at a number of options. Oldfield was not one of them. That's new. I mean, we looked at the possibility of, you know, putting both programs at Burr. But it turns out there isn't space there on the first floor because it has to be at ground level. We looked at the possibility of putting both programs at Dwight. But it turns out they don't really have a lot of extra space. Even though it seems like it, they don't have it on the first floor. So we did explore some other options, but Oldfield was not one of them. Maybe down the road.
Sure. Mrs. Iacono?
Through the chair to Dr. Title, when you say you're going to expand the number of students at Burr, so there'll be more than 20 students there?
Yes. We have 10. Right now it's 10 and 10, right? It's a half day.
Right.
So what you have is a full-time teacher and a full-time para for 10 children. That's a very rich staffing ratio. I mean, we opened Wittenberry that you visited last time, which is like class magnet school. I mean, that has 18 in it at a time, full-time teacher, full-time instructional assistant. So we're thinking we can go between 16 and 18. It's a full-size classroom. We have the staff. We don't need to add staff to do it. I also think we should expand that to 3- and 4-year-olds. I think limiting it to 4-year-olds really lessens the impact. If we really want to get kids ready for kindergarten, doing it half a day for 4-year-olds only, I think has limited impact. If we had half 3-year-olds and half 4-year-olds, then you can have the kids there for 2 years half day, plus half the kids sort of graduate, the other kids stay, and the teacher doesn't have to restart all the routines. You've got role models in the classroom. You got the, and many pre-Ks are mixed age. It's a very common and considered to be a best practice. So we would be increasing the ratio there, but at this point, we'd still have an incredibly favorable adult-to-student ratio in that classroom.
So are you going to 3-year-olds? Are you going to open it up to 3-year-olds?
That would be the, yes.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. And by expanding, now the 4-year-olds, they all graduate. So it's, right, so, it isn't like we have to grandfather anybody in.
Right.
So basically, when Anna gets to do her recruiting, we'll have X number of slots for 3-year-olds, X number of slots for 4-year-olds, and then you have to do some maneuvering with twins and siblings and this sort of thing. That's very manageable in terms of the lottery. All the early childhood programs have to do it. So you want to keep, if you have twins, you want to have them both in or neither in. And once you have a sibling situation, you want to make sure they can go there. So that would be the plan. I think that's an educational improvement for that program. It's not a cost. Doesn't cost extra to do it that way.
Great.
Mr.
Thank you.
Carey?
To this issue, what do we estimate we're gaining in terms of savings by taking advantage of these efficiencies by using these other two facilities, Burn, the ECC?
$100,000.
Thank you.
You mentioned something, and which will prompt this next question. Is this budget with respect to kindergarten next year? Does this budget reflect the same type of program that we currently offer for kindergarten?
Yes.
For next year?
There's no change in kindergarten in here. It's been a subject of discussion at the board. It's been a discussion in the audit. The audit floored me. We have not had a chance to process that recommendation, and we're coming back to you in March with some thoughts about the audit. So until we can process that and really come forward, we moved forward with the same program. The exception being, in the description of the elementary staffing model, there's a change in the way paraprofessionals are allocated to the elementary schools. The previous way paraprofessionals were allocated, basically, if you had a blended or a full, you got more para support than if you had an extended only. And so there was some built-in incentive to run blended or full versus extended. And to completely level the playing field, we changed that formula so that every kindergarten, regardless of flavor, gets the same per kindergarten classroom allocation. I think it's a 0.8 per kindergarten. So there's no incentive in there to run any one particular kind. But that's the only change. It has a negligible effect on the budget because it's pretty close to what we were doing now. But there was some concern on my part that we had built in some incentives to steer people in one direction. This removes that from the play. So at this point, we are going forward with the same kindergarten model for next year until we have more time to think about it and look at the budget implications.
I see Mrs. Albin and then Mrs. Iacono. Mrs. Iacono was first. Go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Title, for that, because that has been a source of confusion, I think, for everybody over the past couple of budget cycles. So just so we're then all clear, the policy of the district is to have full-day kindergarten and extended day kindergarten. And in the event that you cannot fill either of a full day or an extended day kindergarten class, the result then is a blended class.
That's correct.
Okay, and everybody throughout the district now has a clear understanding of what that is.
And the,
Correct?
Yes.
Okay,
That
great.
is correct.
Thank you very
And I
much.
wanted to, just if you want to see the description of the paraprofessionals, it's on page 158 in the middle of the page.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for clarifying that and bringing more direction to that area.
Mrs. Albin?
Again, through the chair to Dr. Title, when you make the recommendation to move the high school start time back to 7:30, and there's a significant savings because we can now tier the buses and get more use out of fewer buses. For your sake and for the board members who sit here, it will be an emotional issue on the night that parents can line up at the microphone and ask us to support this program, don't cut that program. So you don't have to answer it now, but could you be prepared at such a time to have something for the board members? We're talking about 10 minutes at one school and 20 minutes at another school. Having been part of the later start time discussion when it was first presented at a CABE convention probably 9 years ago, maybe 8, but could be longer, by the League of Women Voters from Wilton and then State Senator Kevin Sullivan, who were really pushing for later start times. And the information and the studies are out there, but you really have to start school for a high school student to really benefit from the extra time at 9 o'clock in the morning, was what we learned in the information. So will you be prepared when the line of parents are out there, please don't change our start time, to be able to provide some sort of information so the people who have to make the decision here will have that as they weigh it?
I can give you the brief overview now. It's not that complicated, really. In a perfect world, we wouldn't have to do this. This is largely a financial decision. There are some advantages to it operationally, but if these were the only advantages to it and it didn't save any money, I wouldn't be recommending it. It will have a positive effect on the traffic, the increasing traffic on the Ludlow campus by separating that out. In one quick review by the athletic director at Ward, we will cut our early dismissals for athletics by 50% in terms of that student time lost in seats, as well as our teacher coaches who have to leave and the students who are therefore not being taught by their regular teacher because of early dismissals. Those are a couple things that will happen. But yeah, I mean, if you can argue that, you know, sleeping an extra 10 minutes, an extra 20 minutes is helpful, but you have to weigh that against, you know, there are some advantages operationally to it. We do have some shared staff between the two schools that having the times off by 10 minutes is problematic. Keeps us from sharing as efficiently as we'd like to. But again, that wouldn't be the reason to do it. In other words, I don't want to go out there and say that those advantages I just enumerated make the case for changing it, because had the savings come back and it was $20,000, I would not stick my neck out because I was warned that this is an emotional issue. I know there was, because I went through this in my prior district, I know that it's a huge issue, but I felt obligated to cost it out. And when I saw the trade-off between the savings and the benefits and the negative impact of it, I'm recommending it. But the board chooses not to do it and wants to put $500,000 back in, your call. That's my quick overview. I don't have a lot else to give you on it, although I did warn Mr. Coyne that I would have him come up and testify and swear on a Bible if he could think of something else. But I think I hit the highlights, Jim. That was the script. All right. That's it. He prepared the witness. But that's basically it. I mean, I don't intend this to be, you know, to give you a white paper on the benefits of the earlier start time. This is really in the context of the budget, looking for ways to save money that allow us to keep our program going. That's really what this is all about. I'll make no bones about it.
Go ahead. Mr. Carey. Yeah. Go ahead. You're up.
So I want to focus a little bit tonight on the macro. I had a couple things in the weeds, but we won't get way into the weeds until next time. Can you just, for our benefit, I see like page 24, Dr. Title, we've got a kind of an overview of increases. So for the board's benefit and the benefit of our public, how many of these items are really, I don't want to say out of our control, but items that are kind of, there's built-in costs with contract negotiations, there's built-in costs with increases in medical benefits. Can you give us a rough estimate of either what percentage or what total of the 6.9 million fall into that category?
It's a lot of it. When you look at the staffing, that first line, so if you think of it's a 4.9 budget, let's say, all right? So almost 2 percentage points of it are contractual increases. The next two sort of net themselves out, utilities and transportation. There's your medicals, another percent. All right? So right now you're at 3. You haven't gotten halfway down the page. All right? Then we've got the pension that Mrs. Brand talked about. That's out of our control. Oh, that's netted off of the savings that Bonnie was able to get from the disability insurance. So now you're at 3.25. Now you got the special ed costs, which I'm telling you right now, you can cut it, but it's be a fantasy budget, you know. And I'm really not into fantasy budgeting. So I don't really think there's much you can do there. Right? So now where are we? 4? Just keep adding, right, in that range. The staff new to the budget, that's, again, those aren't all new positions. Those are existing positions, a lot of which are in grants, particularly the SFSF, that are coming back to us. I can't really break that out exactly, but, you know, again, there's only 6 new ads, and there's 19 in the budget. So roughly 2/3 of that 0.77, say 0.5%. Now we're at 4.5. So it's decreasing the benefits. And then you flip over to the next page, you know, all the rest of that are pretty much small increases. There are some increases in some contracts in the maintenance area and everything, but there's, you know, technology. We've got some increases that, you know, Microsoft raises the prices and so on and so forth. So, you know, you're in the mid-4s on this number, just, you know, mental math-wise.
Okay.
Because, again, we're not adding a bunch of new programs. We're adding some positions largely to deal with middle school and high school enrollment. So that's where I land is, you know, you're somewhere between 4 and 4.5 or sort of before you take out the pencil. And that's accounting for the fact that we're saving on that audit page $869,000 in savings from moving some utility costs and custodial costs into the lunch program. Using our we're taking out half the interns, and we're making sure that the remaining interns substitute at least 130 days a year. That's about, you know, all that savings is baked into our number, and of course the medical, the stop loss savings, right, you know, as well. So, you know, you really, and I'll tell you, there are a number of very worthwhile things that came to my attention. I basically said, sorry, no, can't do. You know, we just can't do it. I mean, the number was just getting to be too high. So, you know, we're in the forest, Tim. It's really what it is.
All right, so, and I do appreciate that, and that actually does lead to my next macro level question anyway. You identified roughly $800,000 in change of savings in here that were related to, or at least loosely related to recommendations from the audit.
Mm-hmm.
However, I've heard a significantly larger amount just listening to discussion this evening and looking through the budget, including $500,000 transportation. I'm not sure if that was loaded in the 800. $450 for the stop loss, $100K for the preschool, $219,000 for better experiencing on rebidding the disability.
Mm-hmm.
So your team has already drawn out, I'd say roughly $1.5 million, maybe $2 million in savings that
There's probably another
last year's budget.
$100,000 in revenue that we received that was never directly allocated to expenses. Specifically, in this case, the open choice revenue. That was not designated, I guess would be the best way to put it. Not all of it. We've scooped up. I mean, this falls into sort of loose change under the couch, but it's real money. So we took that and we basically are assigning out all the grant money. There's no grant money coming in where we say, well, we're going to hold back on this and see where we need it. it's all assigned against costs in this budget. So I'm guessing, Bonnie, can you think of anything else that I mean, we cut a lot of stuff that people wanted, but that doesn't really count.
Right.
Yeah.
So,
So we're in the 1.5, 1.6 range of stuff we've already cut. That's easily identified in here. And again, some of it's like, I guess, the catchphrase, out of the box thinking, the putting ourselves out there with the start times and the stop loss and the interns and all that other stuff. I mean, be easier to just go forward with the status quo, and then I'd be here with a 6% budget.
in terms of that, if it wouldn't be too much trouble for one of our next two meetings, if we can get kind of a laundry list of those with it summed so that we know exactly, is one of the things that concerns me as I hear the conversation start, and we get a big number that comes out from the Board of Ed,
Yep.
and there's always a lot of fat in the Board of Ed budget, and therefore I want to make sure everybody recognizes the savings over last year's that has been already incorporated into this as we get down further into this discussion, just to make sure that while we're
Yeah,
finding
we can be
stuff,
more specific about that.
I want you to take
Yeah.
credit for what you did.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I think you saw, it's not exactly the same thing, but an example, we put the gifted proposal out. It could have just come out and add all this stuff. But we reduced some stuff, right? I mean, so people are into, and the elementary staffing plan, it is somewhat of an increase, but a lot of it's netted off against existing costs. That's not exactly what you're talking about, but we've really got people attuned to, if you want to put a new program in place or something, we really have to look for some offsets here. And so there's a lot of offsetting in here in different places. I mean, as Gary got hit with some of these, there's 10 grand here, 15 grand here for different accounts, and we'll put all that together so you can see it, because you add up enough 10s and 15s and it's, a significant percentage. So, there's some smaller lines in there that have been in the budget for years. They say, well, got to go. It's out. So, there were lots of little things as well, not just the big $100,000 things.
Can you explain to us, as you've mentioned this a couple times in meetings other than this meeting, and I know that we've got a deficit with our special education spending and that you've made a change. Can you give us a little more detail in terms of what you saw as problematic with how we were budgeting it and how that's changed and why we've ended up with this larger number?
I may have to ask Bonnie to give a little of the history, but it's been a constant situation where the special ed tuition line has been overexpended. One of the problems is that if you never budget for potential new students coming in to the system, then you're setting yourself up for hoping and praying it doesn't happen this year, and it invariably happens. Either new students coming in or newly identified students, or students for whom you end up in a legal battle with and you need to spend some money on to settle the thing. So it's been a constant sort of deficit problem, and there's been some use of the ARA funds in the last year or two to help with that, and that, of course, those funds are gone. And so we really haven't been budgeting it accurately. There's also rates go up on tuition. That has to be factored into it. This is all aside from excess cost, because we basically holding the excess cost constant. That's not even part of the discussion. We're just talking about gross tuition out the door. And so by not budgeting for any, for lack of a better word, unknown special education costs, we're setting ourselves up for a deficit. And we're not alone in that regard. I went to a meeting of superintendents last Friday. 3 or 4 superintendents around the table. We're $1 million in the hole. We're $500,000 in the hole, even with budgeting for some increases. And so I'm trying to get us closer to the reality, because what happens is when we don't budget it appropriately, you get to a certain point in the year, and everybody sits around and goes, oh my God, special ed costs, Andrea's done it again. And you go through, just not personally, but, here we go again. And so you end up scrambling around and you say, Tom, you got to freeze these projects. And out in the schools, don't do this. And give me 10% of your allocation, right? When just do it up front. Just put the money where you know it's going to be, and don't pretend that Tom has all this money for projects that you know he'll never actually get to spend, because special ed always goes over. So it's more of a sort of a truth in budgeting thing than anything else. So that, I mean, Bonnie or Andrea, if you want to jump in on this, that's my sort of big picture on it. Was not here the last few years. I'm going by evidence that they've brought to me on this. Is that about capture it, or you want to?
No, that about
more
captures
gory
it.
detail?
And I'd just say to you that, no, I don't want to go in the gory details of it.
It's okay.
But up until, really, 07, 08 was the first year that we really started to have a problem in the funding in our operating budget of special education. And it's because we had cut back and we had eliminated everything that Dr. Tuttle referred to of anticipating new tuitions that were coming in. We were on the hope we don't get them mode, and that didn't happen. And so it becomes something that just keeps perpetuating itself because you never can really get caught up. Now, the ARA funding that we have in the budget last year and this year, but last year for special education, we had identified as that's part of what we're going to do to help us get special education balanced last year. And in fact, that's exactly what we did. But we're going to need to increase our operating budget in order to start to compensate for that lack of ARA funding that we have. And the other piece of it is we never know what percentage reimbursement we're going to get on excess cost. So we build it at one level. We, in good faith, reduced it, saying, well, maybe, you know, we are going to get more money that way, but it doesn't always work. And that's one of those variables that we really have a hard time in putting our arms around. So truth in budgeting is really what we're about right now for special education.
Now, I should also point out that Andrea and her staff really do a remarkable job of educating as many kids as possible in district. This is not a function of, oh, we're just sending the kids out because we don't want to deal with it kind of a thing. For the number of children we have in this district and the number of special education children we have a relatively low outplacement rate. I mean, we've built programs, and if there's ways, and we've discussed this, if there's ways to maybe build other programs where we can bring kids back because it's cost effective, you know, that's a good strategy. But looking at, you know, in round numbers, 50 outplacements over 10,100 kids, I mean, that's pretty nice. So I don't see there's a lot of ways to squeeze that back. I really think it's a matter of, you know, you get into a budget crunch, you got to cut your budget. It's an easy number to take a hit at, and hope. And hope is really a lousy strategy. So anyway, that's more on it, Tim. I don't know if...
Yeah, along those lines, is it, just for some specificity, is the money that we used over the last 2 years, did that come out of the IDA Part B funding, the ARA money, or did we pull other monies as well?
Bonnie?
No, it was the IDEA Part B ARA funding.
Can you give me an idea of how much of that we had to use up to cover?
For last year, we used $1.1 million.
We used $1.1 million of that 1.925.
We had anticipated using $750,000 that was built into the budget, but with catastrophic expenses at year end that we had identified in the board narrative on our end of year closing for last year, we had to cap into that. It's also why we spent our budget right down to zero last year, because every dime that we had left had to go to special education.
I should point out that if I had another $300,000 to put in this account, that would get us closer. I'm not even sure this gets us all the way there. This is an incremental step. This is a big nut to swallow. But at the end of the day, I can't guarantee you that this number is going to be 100% of what we need. If you say that, you know, is this all we need, are you sure? I'm not sure we're there, because if you look at what Bonnie just described, 1.1 million, this is not going up by 1.1 million, and that doesn't account for, you know, increased costs of the tuition. So this is taking a bite out of it. But I think I might be back here a year from now saying, well, you know, we don't have to go up 900,000, but we're going to need another little more in here to really make ourselves whole, unless the state decides to become miraculously solvent and send us 100% of our ECS. But don't hold your breath.
The chair's indulgence, I've just got a couple more things, if that's okay, for this evening. And by the way, I didn't say this in the beginning, I should have. Like Mrs. Brand, I'm very happy with this new format. And I do want to thank the team for all the time and effort that they put into this, because I know that dealing with a new financial system is always harrowing. It never works the way it's supposed to. Having dealt with a failed ERP implementation once in my life that an entire business was dependent on, and had 6 months of doing things manually while we tried to fix it, I understand how painful that can be, but doing that and changing the entire format on how you do things is, I think, particularly challenging. So I do appreciate this, because I think that this is much easier to understand. It's easier for the public to understand. So I do appreciate the new format.
Thanks.
One thing that I would like to try to get enumerated, Dr. Title, at least throughout this process, and then on an ongoing basis, and I mentioned this in a note to the board I sent earlier this year. I see that our grant monies have reduced from $12 million and change in 2009 to 2009-10 to our 11-12 estimate is $10,564,621. An ongoing concern that I have, and I believe that we all should have, is that as a quote-unquote affluent community in a state that has a $3.5 billion budget deficit and a country that has a multi-trillion-dollar budget deficit, we need to at least get your team's best guess. And I know some of these are a guess, because I know at the top line from the state, education cost sharing is voodoo. And if I tried to ask you to explain it to me, that wouldn't be a fair question. But
I could, but you really don't want to hear it.
yeah, so my point that I'm driving to is, from a governor's perspective, I think it's important that this board understand, and from our professionals get the best estimate, and then also from our state representatives get their best thoughts in terms of where some of these things might be going. If we as a community have exposure against services that are usually being provided by human beings to human beings with some of these numbers, we need to make sure that we are doing our due diligence in representing that risk, so that the Board of Finance can reserve against that risk. So if we feel that there's some concern that the education cost-sharing model could change and reduce, which I've heard some rumors of that, if we feel that excess costs for special education is going to continue to decline, I understand that many of these decisions aren't made until after the town finishes this budget process, but we need to put a number to what the risk is of potential loss of some of those funds, so that the other boards in this community can properly reserve against that risk. So if at some point before we're done with this process, we can get at least an opinion from your team as to where some of these things are, or if some of these things are just not estimable at this time, and I think it'll be also our duty to reach out to our state representatives to find out what they think. But that's going to be one thing that's important to me. You mentioned the $1.1 million. I understand the SFSF funds, the $512,000 that flips back and forth between the ECS to the state, and that goes directly to the town, and then for some reason for 2 years was given directly to us, and now hopefully it'll flip back to the state and still come to the town. I understand we had to put resources against that and allocate that money. So I understand there's going to be a loss there. But do we have further funding cliffs that have fallen off in terms of head count? And what would that be attributed to? And I asked that question only because I heard that we weren't having funding cliffs last year beyond the SFSF. And I wanted to understand now, if we have to absorb more head count, why that is not at least what my recollection was from last year's budget process.
Okay. Well, the funding cliffs would be easily identifiable in this budget by simply looking through the budget 1011 versus proposed 1112. You know, I mean, you could do that at several levels. You can do it on the page you were looking at in the first case, pages 6 and 7. The biggest explanation for the decrease in the revenue that you identify, the 12 million down to the 10 million, is the funding cliff due to the ARA. You know, that's the biggest, nut there. And so that's probably our biggest, exposure. I don't know, I guess I'll have to ask Bonnie or Andre if there's, in addition to the 1.1 that you identified, is there further funding cliff this is your, is there a further funding cliff beyond that 1.1 in the special ed, or is that, do you think that's pretty much the end of it, or do you want to think about that and come back?
Yeah, let me just think about that.
Okay.
And I don't know the
Right.
answer tonight, but
Yeah,
it's-
I will say, just generally on estimating, where the risks are, just a sort of a big picture thought about that. I mean, that's what makes budget development so much fun, because everything's an estimate. Some things you've got a really good handle on. Like, we know what teachers are going to make next year, and we're pretty sure how many they're going to be in a certain area, so we can be pretty precise about that. But probably the biggest question mark is predicting the behavior of state and federal politicians with respect to where they want to put the money. The state is in the worst shape. To me, we've got the bigger risk on the state side than the federal side. We're more exposed on the state side to begin with. You look at the ECS and you look at the special ed excess cost, together that's $6.5 million of the whole pot. The federal government money has got of course, it's an unlimited printing press. I mean, at some point they'll stop, but there's some pretty strong lobbies to keep IDEA at the federal level whole. Title I is up for reauthorization right now. That's the No Child Left Behind. It's been languishing, waiting for, I guess, the new Congress to deal with it. I think there's always going to be a substantial entitlement there. Where the Secretary of Education was going, and where we saw it under the Race to the Top, was they're trying to push more competitive grants out rather than formula grants. That tends to be a trend. But that's not meeting with a lot of positives. The Race to the Top had, 39 losers and 11 winners, and 39 states were unhappy, and that's a lot of votes. And so I think while there may be a theoretical push for more competitive grants, I think there's going to be a big push to try to keep the formulas pretty close together. So right now, I would think the bigger risk, it's like buying bonds, you've got risks on both, but the state side looks more problematic right now because the state has a balanced budget requirement, and the biggest source of money that goes out of the state to the towns, a lot of it goes to education. But I don't know how I could quantify that any better than that, but at this point, I think inviting the state representatives to give us a, crystal ball on that, they might have a better handle on it. We've got some people in some pretty influential places. So perhaps our senators or representatives could give us a better handle on that. But boy, those are tough predictions at uncertain times. I mean, the governor, when he was running for governor, was very clear he wanted to keep the ECS whole, but then you bump up against reality. Where are they going to find $3.5 billion? Beats me.
okay.
So I think the big picture is I think there's more risk on the state than on the feds. I take that one.
I think my last one, at least, my last one for at least now, you alluded to, we had some on, some off, some here, some there, in terms of employees that we were counting. In the part-time permanent equivalents,
Yes.
were the folks we weren't counting previously, we're counting everything now so we can net it out?
Correct.
Okay.
They were not in the FTE count. You always budgeted for them. They had a line in the budget. It wasn't like it was just blind. But these are folks that work, some of them they work approximately half-time.
Right.
So they're not here like an hour a week. They're not like substitute teachers or coaches. These are people that are, have permanent positions that go from year to year. But in the way the accounting was done, they weren't considered part of the FTE count. In my understanding, that goes back years and years and years. This was not something that was just invented recently. And the reason it came to my attention is that we're trading off some of these positions in our elementary staffing plan, and there was no good way to show that. So it would have looked like we were hiring a lot more staff than we are because we're really netting it against some part-time positions. There was no good way to show it. The biggest category of that will be left after this are the clericals, staff members at the elementary schools. The second person in the elementary office is a 19-and-a-half-hour, for the most part, most schools, 19-and-a-half-hour clerical position. And they'll still be there. But we had never counted them. as employees in the FTE count. So now we have sort of three big buckets we put things into. Operating budget, FTE that comes out of the computer, grants, FTE, and the permanent part-time hourly FTE equivalent. And that's everything but food service. Food service is its own animal, its own budget, its own thing. So that's that total staffing page, which I forget where it is, but that's where it's all summarized.
So along those lines, on page 139, the 2010-2011 actual FTE,
That's the page.
our total based on your new calculation is 1456.9.
Correct.
Unfortunately, I do not have my budget book from last year before me, but I'm almost certain that we came up with a number of total, including grant employees, of 1,416 last year. Permanent part-time equivalents equals 17. I need my 10-year-old to help me with my math. So I'm missing 23 people between what was reported last year and where we are now, and I don't need to answer this right now, but if you can help me square that, I'd appreciate it. That's one of my
fine, I'll look at
that's one of
that,
my
yeah.
in the weeds questions.
No, that's fine. And also, one thing you have to remember, there's not a huge difference here, but this is actual FTE as we sit here today, as opposed to budgeted FTE from last year. So there could be a difference in, this is the actual, I've got this right, this is the actual on the ground right now working here as of this moment, which may differ slightly from what you saw in the budget book.
Or we
last
didn't
year.
see in the budget book. Okay.
Yeah, so but that may explain some of the difference, but we'll dig up the details and square it up. Yeah.
That's all I have at this time, Mr. Matola.
Yes, Mrs. Brand.
You mentioned the stop loss limit. I tried to find it, but I couldn't find it. Where is it in here, or is it?
It's not in there as a
Okay.
separate item. If you go to, it really, it's baked into that $1,400,000 number that's the increase for insurance. Had we not done the stop loss figure,
We would have been
it would
contributing
be
more.
more like 1.9.
Okay.
Right.
And what
There's
number is
another
that?
calculation that we didn't bother to show you that Bonnie goes through to get to that number. And when, actually, you know where it was? On the documents you got from Aon that they passed out at the last meeting. They're not in here. There's a calculation of what the expected contribution is. And the, one of the numbers is the payment of the stop loss. And the payment of the stop loss in their calculation was based on the 150 limit, and that figure was in the $950,000 range. And this brings it down to about $500,000. So it's baked into the number you see, but the exact calculations on the Aon sheets that we saw last time, that's where you can find it.
I'm sorry, because I was looking for something.
Yep.
The difference in the amount that you have proposed in the budget is what, around $500,000
The difference in the premium that you pay is
Right.
about $450.
450.
Okay, that's our savings to the budget.
Mm-hmm.
The difference in the stop loss coverage is, right now, the stop loss coverage is all claims over $150,000 we're not responsible, the fund is not responsible for. Under the new configuration, anything over, these are individual claims, over $300,000. So that's, I know it's hundreds here, it's a hundred,
no, I
so-
understand.
right, so it's 150 to 300. So, and we had Aon look back at least 3 years, I think, Bonnie, on our experience, and it's been negligible. So it's not something that, and they felt that it was comfortable. I tried to talk them into 500,000, they wouldn't hear of it. So I'm a high deductible kind of person on my car, so that's how I look at it. But so that's the distinction. But if you go back to the Aon handout from the last meeting, you can really see the original calculation.
Thank you.
Yep.
Mrs. Iacono?
Can we look at the technology budget or the technology requests for a little bit?
What page?
163. Under computer contracted maintenance, it says there's a rise in the annual maintenance costs for the Munis system. Why is that? Why does it cost more every year to maintain it?
I don't have the answer to that. Anybody want to take it? Bonnie, you want to shake in?
Nancy's in the back. I
Or
don't know if
Nancy? I don't know. Nancy Nash is here.
Ms. Burns?
Burns.
Sorry.
Burns. Do you want to take it? Come on up.
Would you come up? Because I actually have a lot of questions you probably can answer.
Come on
Sorry.
down,
Thank you.
is our tech expert.
The Munis contract that was signed had a clause in it for a, if I recall correctly, and Bonnie, maybe you'd remember, I think it was a 5% annual increase. So every year we can anticipate that they have the right to charge us an additional 5% for our annual maintenance for the Board of Ed portion of the software maintenance, which gives us all the updates and that sort of thing.
Gotcha. Who negotiates that contract?
That was negotiated as part of the bid,
And that's
and that
what
was
the
done by
jointly with the
Mr. Bremer, I believe, was
So
the
what,
lead
the
on
town?
it. The town. Hmm?
Okay. And then I see that we're instituting some kind of new, or you're proposing to institute a new plan to take care of the printers throughout the district. And that costs money to get it going, but do you then anticipate savings over the long term?
We hope to see savings over the long term, and actually, the monies are really shifted from other accounts, so that I have a breakdown sheet that's not in the budget book. But it basically is a net wash. It didn't actually contribute to any of the technology increases. It reflects that way because the monies came out of toner supplies that were funded by the individual school budgets. And we moved that money out of the school allocations and put them into this particular program, which sort of mirrors our copier contract, where we'd be paying per page.
Okay. My other question has to do around the smart boards at Stratfield School. What happened there? We have to replace.
No, there are existing smart boards. We're not buying smart boards with that
Okay.
particular funding. There's basically two things. One is that they gave us empty conduit in the individual classrooms in the building. There were 12 classrooms that had projectors and mounted smart boards in them prior to the renovation. What we want to do is mount the projectors, and we need various cabling to connect the video and the audio systems together. We didn't get that cabling as part of the building project, so that's why we're asking for it. The other factor is that they had acquired a number of different kinds of projectors over the years to support their smartboard implementation. Some of that was PTA funded, some of it was capital funded. That particular building has primarily vaulted ceilings, so they're very high, and so as traditional ceiling mounts, similar to what we have here, really doesn't work well in the classroom. We'd have a very long pole, and that would be subject to vibration, and so that would be an issue. So what we want to do is replace those projectors by installing what they call short-throw wall-mounted projectors, which go on the back wall over the what you'd consider the traditional whiteboard. And support the smartboard in that fashion. So we're asking for the funding for those projectors. What we'll do is we'll take the projectors that Stratfield has and we'll reallocate them in the district for other purposes.
Gotcha. I'm going to ask this question. I hate to ask it. If we are pulling back on the smartboard initiative because we're working on a fuller plan, why are we moving forward with this?
We're making them whole to what they had previously. So we're basically putting them back the way they were previous to the renovation.
Why wasn't this funded through the building committee?
I don't have an answer for you.
That was a rhetorical question, right?
Yeah.
Let me just talk about the
Sure.
whole smart board and equity thing, because it's a big thing, and my original plan going into this budget was to try to begin to remedy the inequities at the elementary schools with the smart boards. We have done quite a bit of work to identify what percentage of classrooms at the elementary level have smart boards in them, and it varies tremendously from school to school. But the fact of the matter is that at this point, not only do we need to develop, I think, a better plan to integrate them into the instruction and to the curriculum and so forth, but we're not going to have the money. So I could put them in here. They would never survive. So why fantasize about it? This is really a financial thing. I mean, the tech budget here with Nancy's cut that she had to go through, her capital request is virtually flat with the current years. The biggest piece that's going on is finishing off this backbone project with the switches, which is not sexy. Right? Really, I mean, it's really arcane, behind-the-wall stuff, but if we don't do it, the stuff doesn't work. And so we can have all the fancy stuff on the front end, but then you can't download streaming things because your backbone isn't strong enough. So the good news about that is that that's really off the books, so to speak, at the end of this upcoming year. And without adding another dollar to the technology budget going forward in the 12-13 year, we can start to make more progress at these inequities that are out there, and that gives us time to come up with a better game plan to do it as well. So that's why we pulled the plug on it, because, so to use the expression, yeah, I mean, it's disappointing. There were easily, legitimately, another $1 million of very worthwhile requests that came forward from the tech people for this budget that I basically said, too bad, so sad. It was an exercise in subtraction, right? Okay. I'll say it in unison.
You actually answered one of my questions, which is what aren't we getting in this budget? But it's about $1 million worth of other technical requests.
That's just the beginning.
And then my last question on the technology is the installation of the multimedia projectors at Ludlow High School. How long has this been on here? I feel like we see this every year.
I think this is the third or fourth year we've asked
request
for
and then
that.
it never happens.
Right.
Okay, so this is the third or fourth request on
Yes,
that one.
mhm.
And this still won't make them whole, or this will?
It's almost. I think there's, if I remember correctly, about 10 rooms that may not be completed. We'll try to stretch the dollars as best as we can, but based on our current estimates, we think we'll get to that point. Excuse me? Yeah, right. It's really completing the part of the old middle school that was the high school before it was the high school.
Yep, no, I remember.
It's a high school, then
A middle school and a high school.
Right.
High school when I went to it, and then it was a middle school when my son went to it, and now it's back to high school.
Should have stayed at high school, but that's another conversation. Thank you.
Anybody else? Yes, Mr. Carey.
Just a real quick, to Ms. Iacono's point, and I guess this is rhetorical too. I understand that we have an ed spec that asks for smart boards for that building, and I understand that we're not going to be doing technology like that in a bonding level, but the infrastructure to the devices, wiring, it's kind of like saying, oh, we're going to put electrical outlets in here, but we're not going to actually run the wires for electricity. That's something that I think that we need to be more clear on in the future, or I don't know what our impact can be on that, but it's problematic if we have to go into our operating budget to do something that's part of a $17 million plus project. So I'll make that a rhetorical statement, but it does lead me to another question I had that I forgot to ask, but this is as good a time as any. I know we don't specifically vote on, but do a sense of the body, if I recall, for the non-recurring, now what's called the town capital improvement projects. And I see on here, and one of the things that stood out to me, through the chair to Dr. Title.
What page you on?
I'm sorry, page 174. I see $150,000 for building project support.
Well, there's a good example.
And I understand that we have unforeseen problems. I know we did at Stratfield, and I suppose we own some of that, so we do need to have some budget for that. But aren't there contingencies for these projects that they handle unforeseen problems?
I'll let Tom handle this because we've expended quite a bit of money out of this current year on this. I mean, you still have to get the building committee to authorize the unforeseen. And if the work has to be done and the building committee won't pay for it, even if they have it and they have a contingency, we get stuck with it. I mean, say more.
That's correct. Last year's budget, we had asked originally in the beginning for $100,000 for Stratfield, just knowing that certain things would come up that probably wouldn't fall purview under the building committee, or the building committee may not cover it. This board cut that to 50,000, and then the 50,000 was totally cut out of the budget. To date, we've spent about 40,000 at Stratfield out of our operating budget that we didn't expect. Things like filling the new oil tank, transferring oil out of the old tank to be removed, the architect's design for the boiler when the boiler went, and we were thinking of designing one that would go with the original project. And I have an outlined list I can share with you if you want. But we've spent about 40,000. That did not include the chimney that got struck by lightning and cost us some money in design work and repair, even though it may be covered under insurance. So we anticipate these type of things to happen with a project, and building committees generally ask us to cover some of them because they don't feel they're part of the project. So we're anticipating it for Fairfield Woods Middle School, and we're trying to put some in there for the rest of Stratfield.
Yeah, the kind of thing that can happen in these is you get into a mad scramble to open school, like we did. It happens every year, every project. I don't care how well planned it is. You incur often a lot of unanticipated overtime.
Moving
for your
costs,
own staff.
teachers to have overtime and come in and pack and unpack.
You know, you bring in the custodians to work, double shifts and so on and so forth. That's not reimbursable by the state. You can't get state reimbursement even if the building project took it on. So that kind of stuff happens, and we know we're going to get hit with it, and so to not budget for it is just, again, setting you up for a deficit.
Okay, so I guess that my one comment at this point, and maybe we can work towards this, and again, I know this is just a sense of a body for this body, but I'm fairly certain, based on watching the process over the last few years, that the town's not going to write a short-term bond for contingency. So we're going to have to, if we want to ask for this $150,000, allocate it to something that's bondable, if we want to put it in this particular fund. Otherwise, I don't think it's going to get very far. So, thank you.
The other thing that ended up on this list, something like that, Tom had another legitimate long list of repairs and maintenance projects that need to be done in these buildings. And some of them in the sort of fairly big ticket category, they weren't going to make it. They weren't going to make it into this budget. They're legit. There's no room for them. And if they were in, they'd be gone in May. So we tried to take the most pressing ones and put them in here to signal that they're important. Whether they ultimately survive, if they don't survive here, they weren't going to survive in the operating budget. So this was our last hope. Perfectly honest with how it plays out, that's it.
Yeah, no, and again, like I said, we want to get you those funds if we need them. I think that
Right.
the point would be to allocate them to something that we can bond.
Okay.
Mrs. Iacono.
My question is around the bathrooms at Dwight Elementary School. I know this comes up every year, and there's an argument, and it gets cut, but why aren't we asking for them? We know they need them.
Dwight's was cut 2 years in a row. So we did a thorough review and actually found from our licensed plumber that Jennings bathrooms were even worse shape than Dwight's. So we did a tour of Jennings bathrooms, my team, and we agreed that we would put Jennings in front of Dwight then, and maybe with the Board of Finance asking for a tour, we'd go to Jennings and try and get them to buy into doing Jennings.
Okay. And then I know you, Mr. Cullen, generally have a list of, I forget what you call it, priority 1, priority 2, or
Correct.
whatever. So these are all from your priority 1 lists? Or
Yes.
How did?
Yes.
We
No.
cut about $810,000 that you're not seeing that were priority ones.
Right. Yeah, the major maintenance that's in the operating budget, those were all priority 1 items. In addition to those priority 1 items, there was another $800,000 of priority 1 items that are not in here. Not to mention the priority 2 and priority 3 items that never saw the light of day in my review. So that's some of the priority 1 items, as I just explained, that even those couldn't get in, some of those are over here too.
Thank you.
Mrs. Dow.
Hi. Since we're towards the end here on the capital improvement page. I just thought I'd jump in now. I really didn't have any questions. I do want to say that I also really love the new book. It was very user-friendly, much easier to understand and work through. So thank you to you, Dr. Title, and to Bonnie and all your staff for all the work you did on that. I do want to make mention, though, and I did talk to Dr. Title today, so he's not surprised, but we don't need to talk about it tonight, but I think at some point, yes, we need to have the discussion before the vote, instead of just voting on the entire budget, but I'd like to break out the high school start time piece because I can't support that. I mean, I know it's a huge savings, and that's why Dr. Title said it's in there, but going over all that research for so many years, I'm not behind moving the start time back. I think the kids need to sleep, and even if it is only 10 or 20 minutes. So I just want to put that out there so that it's not a surprise come the night of the vote. And I don't know when people want to discuss it, but I just wanted to share my opinion on that for what it's worth.
Okay, thank you. I should also point out that there are a couple other pretty instrumental people in the office on this. Jan Burns did heroic work after the snowstorm and really was the format person on this that brought it all together. And Carl, the programmer in Bonnie's office, got the stuff that comes out of Munis to actually look readable. I've yet to see a system that can spit out the middle part of this budget. You know, it's usually in like 4-point font. It's all squished together, and it's impossible to read all the way across. He was able to do the magic with it that Munis couldn't do and still hasn't done. So I just, while we're in there, I thought I'd throw out a couple more
And could I just
compliments.
add Michelle
Have a
Cardente?
positive tone to the evening.
Could I just add Michelle Cardente, too?
Oh, yeah.
Without her,
Right.
this wouldn't have
yeah,
happened.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And there's probably 4 or 5 other people I haven't mentioned. That's always the risk of starting to mention specific people. And there's other people sitting around this table that put a lot of work into it. I know it just sort of comes out and you look at it, but this was 4 or 5 weeks of intense labor. And that blizzard came at the worst time. That's all I have to say. Sorry, keep going.
It's like an Academy Award speech.
That's
You don't,
right.
you don't want to
Right,
forget
right,
someone.
Right. The number may be too high, but the book looks nice.
All right. Mrs. Brand.
There was just one thing. I wanted to be clear when I spoke earlier that I was talking about the space at Oldfield, that there's the Child's Garden, not the entire facility. So just in case there was any confusion. But again, if someone's offering. Sorry, I just had to do that since couldn't let it go. I also remember at one point in the summer, and then we saw it again in the audit, but a student management system was an issue that came up in that it could produce cost savings, and the other thing is that I liked a real lot is that it allowed us to follow our students and also the impact of our programs. I didn't see it here, but I'm sure it's with a reason. I just would like to hear the reason.
The reason is it was cut. How's that? Cost too much for this year. In fact, if you look at the audit, they do talk that through, and they show that as a net cost. You know, they had certain things in there where it was going to cost you money. That was one of them. Their number, off the top of my head, was somewhere between $250,000 and $300,000. You know, in the priority list, we think we need more time to really research this anyways. There's several different vendors. Some of them are going to start coming in the near future to make presentations. It's a monumental shift. You don't want to leap into it. So the need is there. But this budgeting is unlimited needs and limited means. And this bit the dust. So, I mean, there was a lot of dust biting, and that was one of them.
Mr. Fadaby.
I just have one question, I guess, or maybe 2 questions. We'll see. On page 3, you indicate the savings that were incurred due to the implementation of the operational audit. And you indicate a savings due to the difference in the start time at the high school of $500,000, presumably from transportation costs by tearing the buses. Is that my understanding?
That's correct.
And then if you go to page 64, I believe it is, which has the transport, real quick here. The budget item 317, student transportation totals, you have an additional cost increase over the overall transportation budget of $139,000. And my question is, why weren't those $500,000 in savings realized in the overall budget?
Well, they were realized. That number would be $639,000 were it not for the $500,000 in savings. The vast majority of the costs is the change in the special ed contract. If you look above to the 54405 line, that's part of it. And the transportation contract itself has a 3%, I think 3% COLA in there, so that contract was going to go up by itself. And although I hate to mention it, we did add some buses for the grandfathering, and that's in there as well. So all of that basically is to say that this keeps us really close to flat on transportation. Had we not done that, we'd have to increase that line by $500,000. It would be the line that's labeled transportation contract under business services. The $4,271,452, that line would go up by $500,000.
Right.
I have a question on that. We were, and maybe a board member has to remind me, we were discussing, particularly at the high school level, doing an opt-out of the buses with the idea of maybe saving some money. What have we done with respect to that, if anything?
That's in the audit as well. The specific recommendation in the audit was that students who drove in exchange for getting a parking place would be required to give up the transportation, if I remember that correctly. Yep. In the limited time that I could ask John to take on a project, I thought the best bang for the buck was the start time, had the most promise for the most savings. Estimating the savings on that requires and will be dependent on who the kids are that are driving and where they live, which we know about half of them right now because they're probably juniors. Seniors are graduating. It would be very difficult and very time-consuming in the time we had to look at this. Remember, the audit came on December 14th, and this budget was done about 3 weeks later. We've not had a chance to model, say, given the current configuration of drivers, what that might mean in savings. And so if I can't put a reasonable estimate on it, I don't want to say it's a bus, 2 buses, no buses because of where the kids are living. We just have not had a time. The clock ran out on researching it. We'll look at it. If we think we can come up with a substantial number, then it might be worth, doing. There's always a caveat on that, and it's even in the audit, that, a kid gets grounded, like I grounded my daughter and told her to take the bus, and that's the way you're going to get not grounded, right, is you got to have a bus available in those cases, right? So with some notice, obviously. So that one takes a little more time, and the return on that investment of time didn't seem as great. But it's definitely under consideration. That's not a recommendation we're rejecting or anything like that. Just haven't been able to put a number on it.
Your child's response to that's going to be, but Daddy, you're costing a taxpayer Fairfield a lot
That's
of money.
right. It was a great move, though, because what I did was I didn't want to have her to sleep in and then have Mom drive her, so I gave her twice the length of the grounding, and every day she took a bus, she got a day taken off. Okay. It's a little tip.
Mrs. Brand.
There you go.
As I recall, I think when Mr. Fickey actually schedules the buses, he's taken that into account, and if I remember him telling us, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, that when he looked at the high school, he did his best guess and tried to adjust it accordingly so that you weren't having a high school bus drive around half empty.
If we can come up with ways to increase the efficiency of the high school buses, it would save us money and public comment on it. So it's definitely something we'd like to do. It's just a tricky one because people are reluctant to permanently give up their seat because you never know when they're going to want it back for legitimate reasons. And so, how they came up with an estimate in the audit for a figure on that, I don't know that that was done with much, in the time they spent on it, I don't see, that seemed to me like it was a wild guess. It was a better, more colorful way to describe the guess, but I'll leave the other word out of it.
A few other questions from me. I'm on page 174 on the proposed town capital improvement projects. Just a general question. For example, the Jennings Elementary School bathrooms, and do we have the laborers with the skill sets who are full-time employees to replace a bathroom? That's Tom, yeah.
I would say no. You know, we have one licensed plumber. So
Right.
to pull him to do a large bathroom job that could take him, 6 to 8 weeks means he wouldn't be able to do anything else in the district.
Okay.
So we have the skill set, but we don't have the manpower.
I mean, and maybe there's something you have to look into. Is it ever worthwhile, I mean, to maybe hire one or two plumbers, they're full-time employees, as an example? It's kind of like the guy or guys who paint the George Washington Bridge. That's all they do. And when they finish it, they go back to the other side and start over again. You know,
Urban legend.
probably is, but it's a good example. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that this is an awful lot of money to replace bathrooms, and I know it's expensive, and sometimes it's worthwhile hiring somebody full-time because in the long run you're saving money. And, I think that's something that we need to look at. You wanna comment?
I agree. In fact, it didn't end up in the audit report, but when they were debriefing with us before they left, and the fellow that was doing that, he identified to me, I mean, because they're supposed to produce cost savings, they of course didn't put this in, but they had discussion with the guy, Paul Tate, I think was one of the guys. He said, you guys could definitely benefit from 2 or 3 other more licensed people, a plumber, electrician, HVAC, something
I
along those
agree.
lines. So something to look at. And if we could identify that it would save us a certain amount of money in outsourcing those, maybe it would be closer to a, 0, but, we're also sensitive to the FTE count.
Okay. Can someone explain to me, this is a totally different subject, what exactly is our continuing education program? Is it for those individuals who are seeking a high school degree?
Gary's coming back just in time. I'd take a stab at it, but you probably know more about it. The adult ed, continuing ed?
It's
Gary,
it's
yeah.
our adult education program that's run through our office.
Okay. And are these adults who don't have a high school degree who are seeking
No, this is
it?
open for the community. It's
Some
some of that,
are.
but most of it is interest-driven, community members.
Okay. Is it,
Jack, do you want to add to that?
do we charge tuition?
Right.
Oh, yes.
It's,
We do.
Yeah.
we're responsible for the equivalency diploma for those people
Right.
who need the GED, but the rest is all covered through tuition and becomes a wash in a lot of ways.
But there is a subsidy in the budget
Right.
for senior citizens
15,000.
to take
$15,000
courses at a reduced rate. So we do subsidize it to the tune of $15,000.
Well, what is page 13, $233,543 total continuing education budget? Is that a grant? I don't know. Right here. That's the revenue, okay, I'm sorry.
That's
I
the
misread
wash.
that.
part.
That's, yeah, the revenue.
That's the money, okay, gotcha, thank you. All right.
Yes, that's correct. And there's a $3,500 line in there also in the revenue section, and we get that money from Easton because we provide the GED courses for them.
Okay. Mrs. Iacono.
That reminded me of the discussion that we had last year, but did you give any thought to the building rentals charging back to, Tom's laughing. Why are you going there, Mrs. Iacono? Charging back community members where we don't charge back now? Dead on arrival? Don't want to go there? Let the board do it?
The answer is we did not discuss it, correct?
Correct. I think
That's the
from
answer to the
years
question.
past.
believe that's revenue to the town anyways, right?
Is it revenue to the town?
After expenses for the rental it is, but
Right.
for all of the custodial fees that we are paying for, we get reimbursed for that.
So that would help.
For those.
So if we were to move in that direction, that would help offset our custodial costs that we incur.
Yes.
Correct.
Thank you.
Anybody else tonight? We have Thursday, so if you want to stop and contemplate and review some more, we're going to be back here Thursday. Mrs.
I make a motion that we adjourn because the roads are getting very slippery.
Oh, okay. They are. That's fine with me. Mr. Flato, do you have something you would like to say? About the roads?
Hi, a couple of quick minutes, thank you. Good evening, everybody, how are you? Just a couple of thoughts. I thought you had a very good discussion, and we're asking a lot of good questions. Just to be helpful in two things, and then also to ask two questions. On the revenue side,
Turn the mic on.
that's right. On the revenue side, I think you know, but all the revenues that are designated for specific purposes are the ones that the district really has primary responsibility to set, and those monies go directly to the district. The town general fund doesn't get those IDEA, Title I, special excess cost monies. But the ECS and the monies that go to the town general fund, the town kind of considers those as general money in good years and bad. We've never formally allocated those amounts and said, well, the ed budget is going to be affected by that one way or the other. There have been some years when those funds go up and some years when those funds go down. I will tell you that so far in my discussion with Fiscal Officer Hiller, our gut is that it's going to be hard to assume an increase in the ECS to replace the ARA money. Our gut is, based on what we're hearing from the state leaders, that probably that's a rough thing to expect, and we'll probably take a pretty conservative view on that revenue source. But that's not, I mean, whatever you put in your book, we finalize that for the Board of Finance. So I just wanted to mention that kind of for your information. As well, also, I believe you do charge for your custodial expenses for all this after-school meetings, and you do get reimbursed for that. I think 99% of the time, except for school-related groups like Scouts or like PTAs, but every other group pays for their overtime and pays for the custodians to you. The second thing is, and this is, I guess, the big item, and it's kind of my biggest question. You know this is not going to be an easy process, and you probably, most of you know what we know, which is the number, with many very good reasons for it, the number that the superintendent is recommending appears to be higher than 80 or 90% of the other Fairfield County districts. And those numbers are already floating around among finance officials and other mayors, and unfortunately it's a comparison we have to make. Most districts are lower. And so one thing I would ask you to do, which sometimes in budget books you do, is to try to put some comparable statistics in per capita spending for some of our Fairfield County colleagues, Greenwich, Darien, those districts you wish to compare to, West Hartford, and try to cull that information to try to explain where we stand in that regard, because we haven't seen that in a few years. And it might be helpful, even if it were to be categorized, certain staffing ratios. Your own audit indicated there are certain parts of your staffing structure that are beyond the average, significantly beyond the average of quality school districts in terms of the ratio of staffing, for example, non-teacher certified. So I think those things you have to look at, and I think more information you can give us would be helpful. But this is going to be a difficult budget, make no mistake about it. And the last thing I'd offer is if you can try to perhaps give a 3 or 4 year history on some of your key non-personnel related issues, technology, maintenance, and just give us kind of a year-by-year summary, so when we get there it'll save the town officials time to ask for that stuff later. But I think this budget book is, I totally agree with the comments that, and I've only received it out of the envelope today, so I haven't obviously looked at it in depth yet, but it appears to be a very well laid out, interesting, thorough examination of your accounts, and so far very easy to follow. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Iacono?
I just have a couple of closing comments regarding the First Selectman's statements. A lot of those municipalities that he's mentioned, their teachers are taking a 0 this year in their budgets. That's why they were able to come in with numbers less than ours. Regarding the custodian statement, I'm not exactly sure that it's entirely accurate, so we can look into that and discuss that on Thursday if that's okay. I think that's it.
Yeah, we'll be back here on Thursday. Motion to adjourn. Mrs. Albin, seconded by Mrs. Dow. All in favor? Aye. Thank you.